Yeah, so let's talk about we'll first kick this off and we'll talk about Trooper Proctor. And let me get this proper here. We'll talk a little bit about Trooper Proctor. So Wednesday was the official hearing of Trooper Proctor. And it's funny because I went into this thing about, I think a lot of people thought that this was going to be the be all end all with him. But I remember reading a report, and I tweeted about this just about a week prior to the hearing, that Christina Rex reported, WBZ said that there was actually going to be two trial dates. And I found that to be interesting. One was obviously yesterday, the 15th, but she also said February 10th. And I said, keep this in the back of your mind, people. This is not going to be the be all end all here. I think, in my opinion, I think this is going to be dragged out, and I think it will be dragged out past the Karen Reed trial. We know that he's also involved in another high profile case here in Massachusetts, is Brian Walshe, and that trial is not going to start until October of 2025 is the said date for that trial. But I just like to hear your opinion on this, Todd. And then maybe I have a presentation here. We can bring up actually what the process is that goes on inside one of these trial hearings. So what do you think about the Proctor hearing yesterday?
Yeah, many of us were waiting to hear kind of the final decision, and we're going to get into kind of the approach and the process. But this is complex, and typically when there's misconduct that's been identified, and the internal affairs unit gets involved, and they go out and they do their fact-finding mission. They'll take that information and then present it to the trial board based on their findings. And it's at that point where decisions are made relatively in short order. So the only thing, my reaction to the two dates, is that this is complex. You have a major trial that's happening in the Karen Reed case, and then you have the Brian Walshe matter, where you have a convicted murderer that is looking for anything to go on appeal. And my gut reaction is that leopards don't change the spots. So if there was certain misconduct in the Karen Reed trial, there probably is some smoking gun somewhere within the Walshe case. So that's what his attorneys are looking for. And I tell you, he won't get let off without another trial. But what a waste of taxpayer dollars! A waste of taxpayer dollars to have even the thought of another trial in behalf of Brian Walshe, who's an actual monster.
This is where I start thinking too. Do you think that, the Mass State Police is really scrambling here, to drag this out? It's kind of like, if you look at the Commonwealth, and let's just take this, if we were the Commonwealth, it's like, well, we kind of need Trooper Proctor involved in this because we have these two whole profile cases. Commonwealth's not going to obviously want to lose him as a witness, but I would think that if the Commonwealth's not going to call him, let's say in the Karen Reed trial, and I believe that they already said that in Brian Walsh's trial, they're not planning on calling him as a witness. But let's just say in Karen Reed's case, obviously 1.0, he was called as a witness for the Commonwealth and defense. But I would think this time around, if he's not called to the Commonwealth, I would be pretty sure the defense is going to call him and want to expose him to this new jury with all the disgusting things and the text messages that he said about Karen Reed. So I look at it and it's like, do you think that the Mass State Police and the Commonwealth is pretty much scrambling here now to see if they can stretch this thing out and get it past, Karen Reed 2.0, with the April trial date? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm in agreement with how you broke that down. I'll add the other wrinkle, if you will, and that is the Municipal Police Training Council, and they are the certifying body for police officers in Massachusetts. So they are 110% involved with this trial board to some degree. But once this trial board is done and complete, then they're going to weigh in as far as his certification status. And that's relatively new. When I came on as a police officer decades ago, you didn't have a certifying body. You were sworn in, you had your oath of office, and that was how you started your law enforcement career.
Hmm.
In this particular case, we've seen police misconduct around the country, and this relatively new process of certifying police within a given state, um, that is part of the process, and even more so during the disciplinary side of things. So they're part of the equation as well, not just the DA Morrissey's office. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, which again makes this whole case so unique with all the different layers and bumps along the road, so to speak.
Todd, why do you think it is that since, like you said, it seemed so simple back then, the way that, officers get sworn in, and they join the force and they go on to protect and serve. But now it seems like we supposedly, and you can see my air quotes here, have more things in place and structure and oversight to prevent more of these incidents like that. Like, let's just take in the case of Trooper Proctor, but it doesn't seem that those systems are working. Why is that? Why? What is your thought on that? If we have these systems in place to protect and to have more oversight and look into these things, it just seems like things kind of just get brushed by a lot of the time.
Well, albeit the process is slow, but the greater damage is police officers that exhibited civil rights violations, criminality, misconduct at an egregious level, gross negligence. For them to switch uniforms and work for another department, that's worse.
Sonia
So,
Massey's case,
yeah,
the
right.
the uh,
So,
the the disgusting police officer, I forget his name, but he was allowed to slip through the cracks in that case, and he changed departments, I think 3 or 4 times until he landed where he did, and then ultimately that tragedy that happened to Sonia Massey.
well, in here you have it that not every state has the certification
Hmm.
process in place, right? So you do have someone like that individual who was able, in who literally was who resigned before he got fired by those three previous departments because of his misconduct. So that's here at least in Massachusetts. Some of the other Northeast states that have a certification process in place are trying to avoid greater harm with individuals who started their law enforcement career and couldn't handle the
Hmm.
authority and all those aspects of being a police officer.
Hmm. Just let me just get this up. Amanda, thank you so much. She's been a member for 4 months. She said, glad to be catching Todd tonight. Thank you both. Well, thank you for being here. All right, Todd, let's do this. I have a little bit of a presentation that I made, and I think I might be pretty good at what I sourced here, putting this together. Todd can let me know if I'm yay or nay, but I wanted to go through an actual trial board process, and I think I broke it down in probably the most simplest form, and maybe you can opine on some of this if I'm right or wrong. So what I did was I put this little presentation together. So a state police trial board hearing typically involves an internal disciplinary process which a law enforcement officer, often a state trooper, faces charges of misconduct or violation of a department rules and regulation. And then it just said, here's an overview of what usually happens during a hearing. So one, the particular individual would get a notice of hearing. The officer involved is formally notified of charges against them and the date of the trial board. This given the officer time to prepare a defense or gather evidence. Can you opine a little bit on that, Todd, and tell us how that type of process works?
Well, in context with Trooper Proctor, when it mentions charges, we're not talking about criminal charges. We're talking about charges of violations against state police policies and procedures. So that although misconduct can lead to a lengthy suspension and or termination, we're not actually physically talking about where there's going to be another court action with jury assembled and a judge presiding over an actual case. This is an administrative process that is done internally And we've talked on the channel before
Mhm.
about, the lack of transparency of this process, how this is not in front of the public eye. This is certainly an administrative action done within the department.
Why is that not in front of the public? Is there any reason to that, or would the Mass State Police ever give a reason why it's not in front of the public?
It's again, it falls under, somewhat of a human resources issue. There's union protections as well.
Mm,
Keep in mind that the union is not going to advocate for anything public against any member of the department. However, it doesn't. The lack of transparency does not mean that the outcomes will be insufficient. I can tell you that the Mass State Police on this is incredibly embarrassed, and it doesn't go well, especially when the governor of the state is weighing in on your conduct as well.
mm,
So, these are things that I can tell you, management, senior management at the top, they're not happy about this. This isn't something that they would protect. So they're going to go full bore during this trial board process and get to the bottom line.
mm. Good to know. So actually, Governor Healy would weigh in on this.
Oh, she's opined on this
Yeah.
during the trial. We were anticipating some very bad information that was going to come when Trooper Proctor took the stand, and then when
Mhm.
we heard how bad it was,
Yeah.
I remember a press conference, not a press conference, but I remember Governor Haley being interviewed, and she didn't have many words to say, but it was pretty clear that this was briefed. She was briefed on the scenario, on the situation at hand, and not at all happy. And that led to, I would say, one of the factors of hiring a superintendent that came outside of the Massachusetts State Police. First time in the
Mm,
history of the state police, Colonel Noble coming from an outside agency.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I'll give my opinion of Maura Healey. I'm not really a particular fan of hers. I won't speak on your behalf, but I'm going to speak on my own. I'm not particularly impressed. It always seems to me that she comes out, makes these statements that she's not happy, and unfortunately, nothing gets done. I.e., Enrique Delgado Garcia. We've heard her speak mostly about this, and that we're going to get to the bottom of it. We're going to find out. It's going to be transparency. And here we are, 126 days from his death, and still no answers. But I digress on that. We'll get to that in the second portion of the show. So then we have point number two: composition of the trial board. The trial board is usually composed of senior officers within the department, such as a high-ranking members of the state police force, and occasionally may include an independent panel. That's very interesting. The board members will have been directly involved in the incident, beginning the investigation to ensure fairness. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, Todd?
Yeah, so the rank structure of the Mass State Police is as follows: trainee, so anyone in the recruits in the academy, Enrique, trainees actually considered a rank, and then once you graduate from the academy, you are now a trooper, and
Mm.
then the promotional process is sergeant, lieutenant, detective lieutenant, captain, detective captain, and then the superintendent will appoint majors and a deputy superintendent. So that's pretty much the rank structure as you climb the ladder. And so within the trial board, I believe is made up of captains or detective captains.
And then what would be something as like an independent panel? Is that like an outside company they would bring in to oversee this hearing, or have you ever heard anything like that?
I'm unfamiliar with an outside panel. My understanding is that it was always uniform rank. Now,
Okay.
there could be some anomalies based on misconduct where there's maybe other outside fact finders that need to be brought in, but I've never heard of an outside panel. Maybe that's just a placeholder in case there's a special circumstance
Got it.
where they need outside experience.
Okay. All right. So moving along, obviously we would have an opening statement. It's kind of like a trial. We're going into like a trial. So you'd have an opening statement. Both the officer face the charges of their representatives, such as a union lawyer or legal counsel. and the prosecution, often the department's internal affairs or appointed prosecutor, may present opening statements outlining their positions. Now, this doesn't take place in like it wouldn't be a court, right? Is it more just like a meeting room they have these in, or how does what does it usually look like, Todd?
Yeah, most likely Framingham, Massachusetts is general headquarters, and I'm confident that trial boards are all conducted there. Some of the trial board members will probably be working out of headquarters, and so they'll basically assemble there. Also, keep in mind that I'll give you a real good example. The CDL scandal with the
Hmm.
licensing.
Yes.
There were 4 members of the department that were charged. Um, One of the members received more gratuities than the others. And so when you hear things like representation from either an attorney or union representation, um, that's where if I'm caught up in something, but I had a lesser role, I'm 100% going to advocate for myself to be able to not justify my behavior, but I don't want to get caught up with someone else's, greedy actions and get
Hmm.
pulled into their story. I'm going to stand up on my own accountability, however good or bad it is, but I don't want to be identified as, receiving the same or being accused of the same misconduct of someone else that had a greater issue. In this particular case, Trooper Proctor testified on stand to in a court of law of all this misconduct. We saw his supervisors that were also involved in this, but obviously they got a lesser disciplinary action against them.
Which is kind of frightening, I would seem. Like, that's your higher above, that's your supervisor, and they're essentially enabling that bad behavior with partaking in this, in these nasty text messages and God knows what else. And I always say this too is I look at this situation and I make this very clear with my, my audience and to put this out there that this is behavior that just doesn't happen in a simple case. This is behavior that according, with Proctor and Tully and Buchanan, more right now, what I see in Proctor is that this is behavior that started a long time ago, and maybe earlier in his life, and this carried over into his professional career. And the crazy thing to think about it is, I'm sure you have to go through a very thorough psych exam to get into the Mass State Police, as most likely you have to do in the military or any other organization where you're going to hold a badge and a gun and protect and serve either the citizens in and around your area or your country. Um, I just it's pretty sick that he was able to really dupe people and trick people past that. And then you have to start looking like, okay, well, if he was doing this in the Karen Reed case, what other cases was he doing this in? What other
Yeah.
conversations was he having with his sister or his superiors or friends or family members? I mean, it's pretty haunting.
Well, you have an aspect here where um, he's working on extremely high profile cases. You know, but before any of these high profile cases, before there was anyone charged with a crime, the media attention that surrounds this stuff, and you're the guy behind the scenes
Hmm.
that's collecting evidence, and you're seeing and have control of all this data and information and evidence that's being discovered, submitted. It's going to trial,
Mm.
and then you've got your friends on the outside that know that you're the guy involved in these. He got out over his skis. He got really cocky, and you just tell the tone in the text messaging between his friends. And then as far as his superiors go, um, I'm sure they didn't understand any type of communications, and I'm not giving anyone a pass, but
Sure.
things are done in a silo. And the conversation with his sister, the conversations with his friends, although similar to his superiors, were done in a silo. and had a different bravado, if you will, in arrogance, to be quite frank, in those communications, and it all caught up to him.
Yeah.
It all literally caught up to him.
Yeah, I think it gets to the point where, some people in law enforcement, uh, after a certain time and their reputation they build, they almost feel like they're invincible,
Yeah.
and I can pretty much do anything and get away with it. And that's when they become scary. That's the scary guys. I mean, there was a guy just recently down in New Jersey, a sheriff that just actually went to prison, I believe, that was scamming the town and the townspeople of like millions of dollars, and actually started to get his family involved in it. And I think his name was James Burke, maybe, or some sheriff. And I don't know if you heard about it, but it's like they get this attitude about him about like, yeah, I'm kind of the guy that runs the town, and gets in with the locals and starts finding loopholes, how to push things around, and that's how we get things like this. How we get people like Trooper Proctor. Okay, let me get into the presentation of evidence. The prosecution presents the evidence supporting the charges, which could include witness testimony, reports, audio, video recordings, and other relevant documentation. The officer and the defense team allowed to cross-examine witnesses and challenge evidence presented. So I'm pretty sure that the tapes of the Karen Reed trial were probably entered into this hearing, if not maybe transcripts or anything like that. Probably the text messages. It probably pretty much just handed the Karen Reed file and said, "Here you go." And that's probably the evidence that was brought into this. So it also says the defense team is allowed to cross-examine witnesses and challenge evidence as well. I wonder what kind of witnesses he would bring in if he had any witnesses. I don't think he'd be using his superiors as they were involved in it. But what would be a type of process like that, Todd?
Well, I'm going to add to the list.
Sure.
You had that federal investigation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You had the federal investigation that really exposed the text messages, and that was just a piece what we got to see during the trial. But there's probably a treasure trove of information that the feds, again, they come in deep and they come in thorough, and they've got the capability to go through and utilize those resources for digital forensics. So there was nothing that could be hidden within within those communications. And I'm even going to go as far as to mention Brian Higgins here, in this part of the conversation,
Yeah.
because those communications were talked about inside, by Attorney Jackson during the trial. So what did that information glean? The other, drinking off duty and driving, in your unmarked vehicle.
Yes.
The Canton police officer that lost his gun and his badge temporarily. All those different things are so damning. So who do you call for a witness? I think he's standing alone on this. I don't know who he could bring in to advocate on his behalf.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to be bringing in someone and talking about his character at this point. I think it's going to be really hard to find a character witness. All right, so we have the presentation of evidence. Then the defense is going to get their turn to present. The officer can present their side of the story, call witnesses, which we don't think is going to happen, and provide evidence that may refute or explain the allegations. The defense has the right to present argument that casts doubt on the charges. So I'm sure that his union representative or his lawyer is going to obviously try the hardest here. It's weird. I think the defense, I really do think the defense, and we heard this during the trial, that, hey, I was under a lot of pressure, and I was, I'm on this high profile case. And it's like, wait a minute, sir. You're trained for these specific incidences. You can't let things rattle you, sir. You went through the Mass State Police Academy. You went through your psych examines, your examinations, your training. You are what? He was 10 years. I think his career started 10 years ago. You've been in this, and I may be wrong on that. I think it was 10 or 15 years. You've been in this for 10 years, and you're going to say now this is what's going to rattle you? It just didn't make sense to me, Todd. What would you think if he posed that type of defense?
Not going to fly. Holds no water at all. And again, when we talk about all the different circumstances that this case has brought out, if there is an accusation of misconduct and the internal affairs go out, they do their fact-finding mission, they present evidence and information corroborating the misconduct. There's still that piece where the the trooper in question still has their say. They haven't given any type of statements for or against the misconduct. In
Mm,
this case, practice before judge and jury under oath.
yeah.
Different circumstance here. How, how do you say I didn't do it?
Yeah. It's there.
The only
It's
apology, well, there was no real apology, but other than, that was not my best self, or, however he framed his words in a haphazard apology, he implicated himself.
Yeah, and Jackson gave him the opportunity. Said, "Do you want to apologize to Miss Reed right now?" And I think that's going back to what you just said. Oh, I was just not in my best frame of mind or my best judgment at that time. So it really wasn't an apology. It really
No,
wasn't an apology.
no,
All right,
not
so
at
we
all.
go into closing statements. After all the evidence is presented, both the prosecution and defense will make closing arguments. So it's much like a trial. This is where each side summarizes their case and argues why the board should rule in their favor. And we go to the board deliberation. After the hearing, the trial board deliberates in private to consider the evidence to determine whether the officer is guilty or not guilty of the charges. They also discuss the appropriate disciplinary action if applicable. Todd, I'm not really sure if you're familiar, but how long does usually this deliberation process last? Could it be, an hour? Could it be days? Or is there a set amount of time on this?
Couldn't speak to the time, but typically it's the same day as the actual hearing. So
Mm.
again,
Oh,
this
wow.
is such a unique case to have that second date in place. Was based on all the moving parts, based on this hearing, this trial board duty status hearing.
Hmm. So then we have the decision. Trial board renders a decision, which could range from dismissal of charges, a reprimand, a suspension, demotion, or even termination, depending on the severity of the violation. Um, I I don't know. I have a hard one. I have a hard time with this one. I still think I still think this is going to get dragged out. I don't see this in any. It's just my opinion, and I may be wrong. And everybody comes back to me and says, "You were so wrong." It was in February, but I just don't see in February they make this decision. I think they continue to try to drag this out as long as possible. Um, who knows? Who knows?
Well, I'll say this, that despite how people feel about Michael Proctor, he is still owed due process. So, he's in a limbo state right now. He's considered an employee of the Commonwealth. However, he's not receiving compensation. He was ordered to turn in his department issued weapon, uniforms, all gear, his cruiser. So either way, there's going to have to be a decision for him to move on with his life.
Hmm,
And so to prolong something like this actually doesn't lend itself to due process.
hmm.
So I was anticipating that we were going to hear something yesterday, but given the February date, I anticipate that. Again, I want to bring everyone's attention to the fact that the Municipal Police Training Council is the certifying body for police officers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So there may be a time where their input in their final decision making is also part of this process.
So Debbie's asking the question: Who would present the evidence against Proctor? That's a good question.
Yeah, the internal affairs would have done all of that due diligence. They would have captured any video. You can go to YouTube and put in Canton Confidential and get a treasure trove of all that different coverage. But that video evidence that was well documented during the trial, that's just one layer of it. Then the text messages, the communications. There's stuff that really wasn't covered as far as a proper investigation. Uh, Brian, we talked about this. How many key players inside the house weren't interviewed in a
Yeah.
timely manner, right? So that's a violation of department rules and regulations and not following investigative procedures. So there's just a number of things that are going to be presented against him that are very, very damning.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, obviously, I mean, duh, I think he gets fired before Karen Reed 2.0. This is a huge win for the defense team. I mean, they may be able to bring this in and say, look, your star investigator here with the Mass State Police not only said all these disparaging things about Karen Reed, didn't follow procedure when investigating this case, could have possibly helped plant evidence. And, here we go. This guy's fired now. I mean, that's a huge win for the Karen Reed defense, which is, it's great. I think it's great. But also, I'm always curious now, are they going to be allowed? Is the judge going to allow that to come into trial the second time around? As we see that she she always tries to block everything. But I think that if it's out there and it's public, I think it's hard to not be able to bring this into trial if we have a second one.
Brian, go back to your point about planting evidence. I'm confident that the internal affairs will thoroughly they're as fact finders, they would have interviewed police officers at Canton that responded from Canton PD that responded to the house on Fairview that morning, early morning. They there's more than what we would consider um, some of the damning evidence that was recorded, publicly recorded at the trial. There's a whole process that would be examined by the internal affairs about, was this investigation actually done on the up and up? Was there bias? Right, that's another violation of department rules and regs of bias
Wow.
policing. So it just there's so much more than what people might be thinking about.
So this could be a huge win for Karen Reed at the end of this. Huge
And
win
and if
is
the
what you're saying.
prosecution doesn't call him, 1,000%
The defense is
sure
going to call him.
the defense is gonna call, and they're
Yeah.
gonna call Mr. Proctor to the
Yeah.
stand, not Trooper
Not
Proctor.
Trooper Proctor. Wow. Just going to get this in. We have a question from Knowing Your Bits from Your Bites. I love that. $10 says, how is not recording any conversation with witnesses considered standard operating procedure? Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Todd, for your great insight. If you want to answer that, Todd.
Sure. I know that when I was in the fire marshal's office and we interviewed witnesses, we actually took written statements. We actually didn't record anyone that we interviewed. So the process was, I would sit down with you, Brian. Brian, tell me about what transpired. We're here for this incident. Tell me your involvement. How much do you know about this? And I would take your written statement, and then I would ask you to read the written statement that I physically wrote, and
Mm,
then I would ask you to, if there was anything I got wrong, put a single line through it. Don't scribble it out. Put a single line through it, and then initial it, and then we can go further down in the paper and make a correction on the error. Um,
mm.
so it was done very methodically and very transparently, even if there was a some type of an error or mistake, or maybe I processed the way the person explained their version of the story. So it was a very methodical process, but it was always a written statement as opposed to something that was a recording.
Mhm. And then finally, we have an appeals process. Depending on the department's policy and nature of the case, the officer may have the right to appeal the decision to a higher authority, such as a civilian review board, or in some cases, the courts. State police trial board hearings are part of the internal disciplinary procedure designed to maintain professionalism and accountability within the law enforcement agencies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the law here, but would Proctor, if he's found obviously guilty of this, and they say, hey, here's your discipline, would he have the ability to appeal it here in the state of Massachusetts?
So I would say yes, there would be an appeal process. However, the decision, if the decision is termination, that will stand. And let's just say some hypothetical scenario that he won his appeal, then there would be some type of a back pay settlement, for the period of time from termination to the change in decision. I don't see that happening, but that's just a hypothetical scenario.
You know,
Also, Brian,
I'm, I'm sorry.
I want to address something that has come up a lot of time in your threads during your lives, and in regarding Trooper Proctor retiring and being terminated, but living off of his pension.
Mm,
Um, Here's the fact: there is no pension that a state trooper gets unless they've hit their 20-year mark. Nothing. There's no lesser number. There's no percentage. Every Mass State Trooper must serve 20 years before they're eligible for their retirement. So Proctor will have nothing of compensation from the Commonwealth in the
mm.
event that he's terminated.
Good to know. Now, I was just thinking too, he gets found guilty on this board hearing. I'm sure that sets up a very nice civil case for Karen Reed against Trooper Proctor, or just Michael Proctor at that point.
It would be Reed versus Proctor, and I would imagine it would be a civil rights violation,
Yeah.
civil rights lawsuit. Um, um,
Um,
it would be violation of, I think, Fourth Amendment due process,
hmm.
or Fifth Amendment. Yeah, fourth or fifth.
So you're thinking on in February we're going to get some type of decision, if
Yes,
in your expert opinion.
yes. I just don't see where these types of situations are prolonged. It's and again, despite what people think about Michael Proctor, um, it this he's due process, and that basically means a timely and fair hearing.
Hmm. So I have a question here from the audience. Can you work elsewhere while suspended?
Not for another police department.
And then if this ultimately sinks him, he can't apply anywhere else, correct? He'll be out of law enforcement altogether.
And that's the connection to the Municipal Police Training Council that does the certification. Brian, I misspoke earlier. It's the 14th Amendment for due process.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So I'm sorry. And then to clarify, if he's found here guilty of this board, fired by the Mass State Police, he can never become a state police or local police officer anywhere, correct?
Anywhere, period.
Yeah.
Regardless of state.
Okay.